Good evening, Shaka. We're just getting started here in Canby, Oregon, and we have a beautiful day today. It's starting to be spring. Oh, you can't see out there, but there's your lovely classmates. So yeah, we're just getting started here. All right, so Daniel just walked in. So let's spend a few minutes talking about our papers coming up. So say again, for Daniel's sake, Caleb, what your topic hopes to be.
It was going to be regarding why God didn't just hit a reset button at the beginning if he knew that sin was going to, take over and have a fallen man. And I was going to argue that God already had a plan at the beginning because he wanted us to choose him, but in allowing that free will would also allow sin to come in. So that's where I was kind of wanting to take it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So even so, when we're asking the question, why didn't God hit a reset button? It's kind of like that's an implicit. Well, let me ask you this: what's implicit about even asking that question in that way? Why didn't God hit a reset button?
God's all knowing, he's all powerful. So it would imply that maybe if he hit a reset button, maybe he messed up.
That's right. Or like something caught him by surprise.
Yeah.
It's like he created this great thing and put Adam and Eve in the garden, and then first he's like, what's Satan doing in there? How did he get in there? And why is he in there messing with my people? And then, oh, why did my people, as soon as they're tempted, they fall? Oh, darn. What should I do? Heaven forbid. Oh, I guess I'll hit a reset button and start over. So let me ask you this. If he would have done that, let's put aside the questions about his, omniscience and all that stuff. But if he did hit reset, what would that new thing look like?
Exactly. I mean, that's where you have to take into account the free will argument, I suppose, because he could make us automatons that just love him, but it's not. We're not choosing to love God.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if he did it again, it would turn out the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think since he created Satan, that was another. He ultimately had his plan, and the reason why I want to write about this topic is I have so many friends who that's one of their main arguments is, and it wasn't recently until I came in this class that I realized, oh, look, I actually have all this idea and way to articulate it. So it's easier for me, and I can answer that question. My only thing is, can I do it in a way that expounds upon that?
And that's so you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the value of a paper like this, because it gives us the opportunity and the challenge to put on paper what we have in our minds. And when you do that, it forces you to, it forces me, and maybe I'm not like other people, but the way it works for me is that I can walk through life thinking I have a clear answer to some of these things floating around in my head. And then when I'm challenged to actually articulate it to somebody, I realize it wasn't quite as clear as I thought, and I start fumbling around with, okay, well, I know I have the answer, but the way I'm presenting it just isn't making sense, and they're challenging me with stuff that I never considered. And so the act of writing it down forces you to move it from kind of floating around in your head to concretely on a piece of paper. And that's I found it to be a really helpful exercise. And it helps clarify in your own mind what you think and helps you think more carefully through the arguments. So I think it's a great topic. Of course, there's always the danger in these papers of you know, you've only got X number of pages to try and, you know, capture this big, huge thought. You know, why did God create this world the way it is?
Yeah.
Why didn't He do it something differently? But having said that, I think in my mind, if I were writing that paper, the answer that I'm driving towards is the one that I think explains so many things, and that is that yes, there is that perfect world that we envision, that when we hit reset, that's what we're talking about. It's like, this world isn't perfect. We want that other world. So, but the Christian message is that that world is real, and that's where we're going. And that is that perfect world, that reset, perfect world. But my claim is, and the way I would be arguing and building up to that, is that somehow this world has got to be the way in which we get to that perfect world. Because otherwise God would have done something different. Not that He would have hit reset, because He's omniscient. So He doesn't need to like test the waters and like be surprised and then start over. No, He already knows everything. So He knows exactly, you know, the beginning from the end. And yet He still chose that it was this creation that He was going to do. So there's got to be some good reason why He did that. And the good reason has got to be that this is the I would say, the best and only way to get us into that perfect world. So then if we start with that premise and then try to argue then, well, what is it about this world then, even though it's not the perfect world, why is it then that it's the perfect world to get us to that next world? And so that's where you can then layer in, like you mentioned, well, I wouldn't call it the free will defense, but it's the necessity of true love defense, and that this is the world in which a true expression of love, the kind of love that then is a qualification of being in the family of God. That's one approach. As I have grown in my theology, and I'm speaking personally, Ben. I'm not imposing my theology on you. I'm just recounting my journey. I've become less and less convinced of that particular argument, and it's because my view of free will has changed over the years a bit, and I've gone from what's called a libertarian free will to what's called compatibilistic free will. And the difference is that they're both free in the sense that we choose freely. We're not compelled in any way to make a choice. And libertarian free will says that, and the very real possibility exists that I could have chosen otherwise. Okay. Compatibilistic free will is a little bit different in the sense that it says that yes, I freely choose what I will, but my will is fallen. Okay? The things that I desire as a fallen human being are contrary to God. So I freely choose based on my will, but my will is broken. And so when I make those free choices, I choose in rebellion to God. In matters of God, in matters of my relationship with God, I freely choose to say no to God. And in a sense, okay, there's nothing like physically compelling me that I can't choose to love God, but it's not my nature, because my nature is that my will is broken, and my will is such that when I freely choose, I say no every time. And that it is the grace of God and the grace of God alone that changes that nature. And so, so I'm 100% dependent on the sovereign act of God to choose me, to change my will. So it's not that I first loved him and then he loved me. So I chose to love him and then he changed me. He gave me a No, it's the other way around. First he loved me and then I loved him. And his love for me was represented by his changing my heart and regenerating my heart, breathing new life into me so that I would be born again and no longer dead. And so that has then implications about that. It doesn't devastate the whole, we have to freely love argument. It doesn't, but it takes on a different slant. Where I go more towards this whole thing is that there is something about the nature of a redeemed sinner that that is necessary for eternal life. And I'd have to, this is where I'd have to work through articulating what I mean by this. But the population of heaven is going to be angelic beings, and it's going to be people, human beings, who were lost and then found, were fallen and then redeemed, and they are people who have put their faith in God, in his Son, in the resurrection. So that's one thing, that the qualifications of being people in the new heavens and the new earth in heaven is that we were fallen and redeemed and have saving faith. The other thing that can only happen in this kind of world is that something as awesome in how it shows the magnitude of both God's holiness and his love, his justice and his love and mercy, that is uniquely put on display at the cross and through the resurrection. And so if we had that world where we hit the reset and jumped straight to the new heavens and the new earth, that event would never happen in history, because there would be, theoretically you're saying, well, God should have made it so there'd be no sin. Well, if he did, there'd be no need for a savior. And so there would be no resurrection, because there'd be no atonement, there'd be no cross. And so, so God's glory as manifest in the cross would not be on display as it is now. And so those are kind of the ingredients that I would stir together in terms of defending, why this world isn't that reset world yet, but that's where we're heading. Okay. So something like that. Yeah. It's going to be great. Good topic. You're going to be really challenged, because you're going to you're going to be going, I only get 7 pages for this? Okay, so what kind of font and how many spaces and right? So please don't fret about it. If it turns out to be a 15-page paper because that's what you want and that's what you need, that's totally fine by me. I'm not going to be nitpicky. In some classes, like some of the classes I took, my papers were down to the 3,000 words plus or minus 50. And so that's about 15 pages or whatever. And it was such a challenge to get it to that 3,000 plus or minus 50. But the reason that they did that is because it's leaning forward a little bit about if you ever were to write with the intent of publication, like for a magazine or something, they usually give you those kind of restraints. So, so that's the reason why. So, anyway. So while we're on that, remind me what you're considering for your paper topic.
Mine is about how should Christianity deal with homosexuality.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And I decided to choose that topic because I think it's really something that's really current.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really coming, especially to, it's also even coming to church. It's a reality that's starting to come into the church. And
Yes.
the big question is, how should we deal with it?
Yes.
And of course, you go to the basics, try to go to the Bible and
Mhm.
when the Lord created and His intentions and all that.
Mhm.
So, my interest is that.
Yeah.
How should we have many things. Okay, we've been having many arguments about
Mhm.
such things. How should we embrace them in the church?
Yeah.
If they are already in the church, how should we, if they need to use the facility to do anything, do we allow them to do
Mhm.
that?
Mhm.
So it's a big thing. We are also instructed to love God and love our neighbors.
Mhm.
So in terms of dealing with that situation, how should we deal with that situation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great one and a relevant one, and you're absolutely right that it's already an issue that has entered into the church big time, and has honestly split churches. So many more liberal-leaning churches have decided that that in homosexual behavior and attraction, that the overriding thing is love, right?
Yeah.
Hey, these people love each other, and who are we to say they can't love each other? And so they've made the attempt to make the argument. Notice how I'm saying it's like I don't think they've made the argument, but they've tried to argue that that the overriding good is love, and that overrides any other teaching against those acts, and therefore we need to not only tolerate but celebrate. And here's where it begins splitting churches, is in do we allow same-sex marriages and the celebrations that go. So can a pastor marry two guys getting married? And then can a practicing homosexual be a leader within the church and like a pastor within the church? And how does that work? So again, a great topic. You'll find an enormous amount of resources for that, and I can help you with that. There's great debates. You can listen to both sides, and so uniquely, here's another opportunity I'll just kind of throw your way, plant the seed. As I was just telling Caleb before we started class, I have the opportunity to be the taxi driver for Alan Schliemann this weekend. So Alan Schliemann is a speaker for Stand to Reason, and Stand to Reason is an apologetics ministry. And Alan's specialty, he has three main specialties. One is Islam, one is abortion, and the reason I'm driving him is I'm picking him up at the Portland airport and driving him to Salem, where he is doing a spring break conference with a bunch of young people, teaching them about the abortion issue and how to approach it from a Christian standpoint. So it's kind of like your paper, except it's about abortion. and equipping them to defend against abortion and giving them tools to do that effectively into their church and into their community. So the third thing that he's an expert on is homosexuality, and for that matter, issues of sexuality in general. So increasingly, in addition to homosexuality, which has been a long time issue in the church, now we have gender identity, which is now the new LGBTQ RSTUV. How does the church deal with, say, a transgender? So somebody comes in and they're a man, but they think they're a woman. So how does the church respond there? And so that's a challenge. Anyway, this guy, he's a really nice guy, and he's an expert on exactly what your paper is going to be about. I couldn't guarantee it, but I'm pretty confident that he'd be happy to talk to you on the phone or via FaceTime or Facebook Messenger for an hour or something. And so if you wanted to take advantage of that, I'd super encourage you to do that. And you can cite him as a reference, so you could record your thing and just say, in your paper, he said this, and I asked him this, and that'd be awesome. That kind of stuff, increasingly, I'm learning is a great. It's a great resource that we now have. These guys, even in the leading ministries, even though they're busy, if you set the bar pretty low and say, I just would love a half an hour or an hour of your time via phone, or better, it's better when you can see them in video conference, and you've got a laptop, he's got a laptop, boom, Facebook, make friends, Facebook Messenger, boom, you're on. What that gives you is you now have access to the people who have spent their whole lives studying the topic that you're starting to get, and you benefit from their wisdom. It's not to say that you put them on a pedestal and they're like the Word of God, but you can learn from them and you can leverage off of their experience, and it adds confidence to your understanding when you hear it from somebody who's really studied a lot, and it gives you credibility too when you're talking about it. It says, hey, I'd love to talk to you about homosexuality. I spent a bit of time researching it, and I even had a chance to talk to this guy who is an expert on it, wrote the books on it, blah blah blah. And so anyway, good. Well, the way I had approached that paper is, I'll show my cards. I think it's indisputable that Scripture prohibits all kinds of sexual immorality, and that includes fornication, adultery, any number of things, including homosexuality. There's some reason why God chose to use the act of homosexuality, particularly men, but women too, as the example to which he points to as this is what happens when people become depraved, right? And God gives them over to their lusts. And what do? They exchange the truth for a lie. They take what's natural and turn it unnatural. And for some reason, he uses the acts of homosexual behavior as the example to point to. So, in that sense, I think we can respond accordingly, and God takes it very seriously. So, the arguments against, or the arguments that try to in my opinion, twist that and conform it to what I want it to say. And there are them out there. You'll encounter them as you research this. They're really weak arguments, and they're clearly taking a predetermined idea that I want to do this, and I'm going to make the Bible say it's okay, right? That's the approach that you'll find invariably. So, but at the same time, as strongly as we condemn the behavior, we need to love the people, right? And that's really where the church has done, I would say, a poor job over its history in then, balancing those two. So I have a very good friend, young man friend, who is one of my son's best friends, and he's 24, 25, something like that, and he came out as gay like when he was 18 or so, and he's a really nice guy. I love him and everything, and it is challenging because he doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to hear anything against it. In fact, he basically said, I've heard all the arguments, I've made my decision, and our relationship will be at stake if you bring it up. So I've honored his statement, but it's still like it's challenging. So yeah, good one. Okay. All right. So great conversation. Let's segue to wrap up the problem of evil, and then start introducing into the resurrection. I'm in our syllabus. I'm finding that I'm kind of slipping a little bit behind, but I don't care. We're doing good. I love the way this is going. So I'm going to keep going. So again, just to remind us, we're thinking carefully about this particular problem, which is a big problem. It's one of the main reasons people still will not be persuaded by all those previous great arguments that we built for theism, because they'll say, yeah, but on the other hand, why didn't God hit reset? Why is there all this suffering and evil in this creation? And if that exists, God must not exist. And so we're going to defuse those problems. Just as a reminder, we have to look at the multiple levels of the problem, from intellectual to emotional. We deal with them differently. And within the intellectual, there's really two main categories. There's the logical one that says that it is inconsistent logically that a good, loving, all-powerful God and suffering could coexist, and therefore God cannot exist. That's the logical problem. Then the other one is, William Lane Craig has called this different things at different times. In this book, he calls it the evidential version of the problem. In other venues, he's called it the probabilistic problem, and I prefer that. So it's more of it's not the logical problem, but it's it's like, okay, God probably would not want to create a world like this with all the suffering if he was good, loving, and eagle. In fact, good, loving, and all-powerful. And he would have created a different world. And because he didn't, he must not be who he says he is. And that's more of a probability assessment. The emotional problem is one that we acknowledge as real. And in acknowledging it as real, that says something. And we'll get to that at the end of today. It's very important, I believe, and I think the church has not done a good job of this, is to to address head on this problem of evil and suffering in the body of Christ and deal with it before you are in the midst of it, and deal with it intellectually so that you are equipped when you are suffering the emotional problem, that you're not also carrying the intellectual problem and being filled with all kinds of intellectual doubts. It's one thing to go through the emotions, but still have that strong foundation that you know you've wrestled through the intellectual problem. So you're not like saying, I don't think God exists because I'm suffering the suffering, because you've already dealt with that. You know that God exists, and you're more saying, God, this really hurts and it sucks, help me. So you're not jettisoning God, you're more like struggling with it, and that struggle is called lament, and I'll talk more about that. So different versions, different levels of the problem, dealt with differently from an apologetic standpoint. We've got to deal with the intellectual one now when we're healthy. It's kind of like, you know, before you're sick, make sure you stay healthy, right? And get yourself nice and healthy so that when you are sick, your body has a chance to heal. So, okay, so we talked about the logical problem, just really quickly to recap that. It's basically the contradiction between this all good, all loving, all powerful God and that suffering exists. And if he did exist, then he wouldn't allow or cause or create a world in which suffering would exist. But here we are, we find that suffering exists, therefore God does not exist. And we basically said that the solution is that it's at least possible that God has some good reason that we don't see for allowing it. And it's important here, when we're dealing with the logical problem, all we have to do is show that there is some way out to break the logic. So it doesn't have to be necessarily the correct answer for why it is. It just has to be a possible answer. And once you give a possible answer, then that contradiction is no longer a logical, it no longer gives for a logical case against God for the reason of suffering. When we move to the probabilistic or the evidential, then we start arguing, well, which one of these answers, if any, is more likely? And is it more likely that God would allow a certain amount of suffering in order to accomplish a greater good? And so that will be the subject of the next argument. So there's multiple reasons why it's possible that God could allow suffering, like suffering forms character. Suffering develops compassion. Suffering reveals our dependence on God. Suffering creates a longing for that better world, that very thing that you're going to contend. Everybody's complaining, why is this world not the way it's supposed to be? Well, what is it supposed to be like? And we have this vision of the way things are supposed to be. Where did we get that? And so sacrificial suffering can be the greatest expression of love. We see that on the cross, where Jesus willingly gave himself out of love. Greater love has none than this, than someone would lay down his life for his brother. It's the greatest expression of love. Suffering could be a self-imposed result of free will. In other words, we can maybe we have ourselves to blame. So it's that free will defense. It's like, well, God didn't cause it. God allowed it, but we bear the responsibility, and there's a lot of truth in that. So again, if any of these are even possible, doesn't say, we're not arguing whether they're true or not, we're just saying, are they possible? Then the logical problem is answered. And so this is why clearly any one of those is possible. And so the logical problem of evil and suffering no longer is one that philosophers use against God. And that's recent. That's in the last 50 years or so. In the past, they argued that that none of these were possible. And that's clearly not the case. Okay, so we're going to move now to the next thing, And I'm getting roasty, so I'm going to take off my cool professorial jacket. And let's talk about the evidential problem of suffering. And this is moving from like, okay, there's a logical incompatibility between suffering and God, to this idea of God, surely he would not create such a world. It's very unlikely that he would allow the degree of suffering present in the world. And so the question really is, okay, so how do we really assess that? How do we judge whether the amount of suffering in this world is too much, and that it's too much to retain the idea of a good, all-powerful, and all-loving God? So that is a question. How do we judge that, or can we even judge that? Are we in a position to be the measure of just how much suffering is too much, and that God shouldn't have allowed that amount of suffering? And if that amount of suffering is there, then God's either not there or he is not good. So this is the syllogism that kind of encapsulate this, and it says if suffering exists, then God most likely does not exist, because if he did exist, then this amount of suffering wouldn't exist. But this amount of suffering does exist, therefore God most likely does not exist. Okay, so let's talk about, and you guys can help me out on this. Let's talk about examples of where greater good seems to result from suffering. So, and you can agree or disagree with me on these examples, but I just threw out ones that came readily to mind. But let's talk about Job. So, tell me what, in real brief terms, what happened with Job?
Job was a pretty good guy.
Yeah.
He was blameless.
Blameless.
And basically, seems like the only reason he is this way is because you bless him. So God allows him to go ahead and take everything away from him. He does. And Job cries out, and says, make a case against me, because basically, what have I done?
Mm-hmm.
And God says, the best line is, where were you when I laid the foundation? So he puts him in check. And he eventually gives Job back double what he had before, but in the process it shows Job that his sin was thinking that he was without sin.
Yeah, good point. He put his blamelessness before God and says, how dare you, God, judge me? How dare you inflict me with this kind of suffering? I would say that in Job's example, Job also carried and was encouraged by a lot of his friends who were trying to help but didn't do a very good job of reinforcing a prosperity gospel, right? Reinforcing the idea that I'm good, God, you give me happy things, right? That's the way it works, right, God? And now that you're not giving me good things, and in fact you're taking away things, I'm still good, so you're not being fair, God, right? You're supposed to give me good things. You're taking away good things. And so long and short of it is that the lesson that Job learned from that was, it doesn't work that way. God is not a cosmic vending machine where you plug in your good works and he spits out your snacks, right? It doesn't work that way. And in fact, God never directly answers Job's complaint. And instead, he redirects the whole discussion to who God is. And knowing who I am, Job, I'm the creator of this entire universe. Knowing who I am, do you trust me? Do you, despite that I'm not this vending machine God that you kind of think of, despite the fact that I can reward or I can give you material blessings or not, and that doesn't change necessarily who I am or who you are. And as a result of that whole experience, not only were things accomplished that were accomplished in the heavenly realm with Satan and his angels, they were all witnessing all this stuff too. But it also accomplished something here on earth, which was that Job ended up changing his thinking about God and realizing that he is a God to be trusted through plenty and through material blessings and not. And it doesn't, our sufferings or our happiness isn't the measure of God's goodness or existence or justice even. And so in the expression that I think captures it all is near the end of the book, and that is that Job formerly had heard of God, right? He had a kind of intellectual sort of knowledge of God, and but didn't really fully understand this gospel of grace, and that he's not looking for us to perform, to be righteous in order to reward us. Instead, he's looking for a trusting heart, and regardless of our situation. And he kind of got it way up front when he said, even though I love the Lord, even though he slays me, I'll still love him. And that was put to the test, and eventually by seeing God, he trusted God and really affirmed his initial response. So to that end, Job became a man who had a true relationship with God, one that was seeing and not just hearing. And so the story, in my mind, the story could have ended there, right? Ended there. Forget that he lived happily ever after thing. So the fact that Job was restored, and then he was, he was again blessed with the material things, is sort of icing on the cake of the whole story. It's not the final end. Job would have continued to love God as one who has seen God, even if his plight remained terrible. You saw that in his character. And but I think the lesson there is that whether or not we are given good and pleasant things isn't the measure of God's love towards us. What he's wanting to accomplish is building the relationship between us. And if that takes suffering, then that's what he'll allow. If it takes, material blessings, then he'll allow that. And he'll grace us with that. So, okay. Gosh, it's 11 already. Why don't we take a break, quick one, and then let's whip through these other examples to see some clear-cut biblical examples of greater good that results from the suffering of saints. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll be right back. Pause for this commercial break. That will be life-changing.
Yes. Yes, it will be.
Yes, it will be. So, but in a good way.
Yes.
We should, Yeah, let's use that as an example of suffering.
That's a very good example.
Okay, awesome. We have a case study here, so tell me about that.
As far as having,
How would you take the example of bearing children as an example? One could argue whether a greater good is accomplished, but
well, I mean, having something that's from you, the combination of the love that you have for one another, and having a son or daughter,
Yeah.
it's probably the greatest gift God gives us.
It
that we
is.
can do.
It is.
However, the process that takes,
involves a certain amount of suffering, huh?
Yes.
Yes. Particularly on your wife's part, and I
Yes.
hope you're remembering that.
I am reminded of that every
Now,
day.
yes, you're reminded of that. Yes, yes, and remembering her degree of suffering will help when you experience the suffering that you ought to experience in the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. period, where you're on tap, and it's like, why is I waking up? That just sounds so terrible. Like the sound of a baby crying at 2 in the morning is so terrible. And I think that's part of God's good design.
Yeah.
It's amazing how annoying. It's like, shut it up. Do anything to shut it up. So you go and, Papa, I'll feed you. No, what? Change your diaper. So anyway, yes, you'll suffer through that lack of sleep and, crabbiness and getting on each other's nerves for the greater good of raising your son or daughter. And yeah, absolutely. And it's worth every minute of it, I tell you. And my experience was, it just, especially through childhood, for me, it was, this just keeps getting better.
Yeah.
It's like, they, I don't know. And still even, my kids are almost out of college. And so now they're like real human beings. And it's like so awesome to have like conversations like this.
Yeah.
And it's like, but yet they're my sons and daughter, and they used to be like these little things. So, okay. How about Joseph? Daniel, tell me about Joseph.
Okay, so Joseph, Joseph had all these like 11 brothers,
Mm-hmm.
and so Joseph had these dreams about that.
Yeah.
That all his brothers and his parents are going to
Bow
kind of
down to him.
worship
Yeah.
him.
Yep.
And also Joseph was regarded by the brothers that he was like the favorite
Yeah,
for the father. And so they didn't like that idea, and so they had this plot to kill him until one of them said, let's throw him into a pit.
Yep.
And then finally they decided to sell him to Egypt. Joseph goes to Egypt, he goes to Potiphar's house, and the wife, Potiphar's wife, lusts over Joseph. And so, because Joseph refused to yield into her needs, then he created a scenario that Joseph wanted to rape her. And Joseph was thrown into the prison. And of course, he suffered going into the prison because of nothing. Actually, he did nothing. And so Joseph is in the prison and he interprets all these dreams. Despite the fact that he went through suffering, there was a unique way that he got out of the
Unbelievable, huh?
prison, because he was able to interpret all these dreams about the king for the king and all that. And so it seems that this suffering for him was setting him up for like a good time ahead of him.
Yeah.
So, and then he comes again, become the one to save his family, who his brothers and of course those who sold him, and the parents from the famine they were experiencing at home and all that. So yeah, I think that's.
And what do you remember what God specifically says about that incident, that whole story? Remember what he said kind of at the end? I think it's Genesis 49 or 50. He says something like,
Isn't it from?
we can
from the
paraphrase.
seed basically from this bad I will bring good.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You meant it for evil, I meant it for good.
Yeah.
Okay? It's like this weird, how is it that God, and this reveals a little bit more about the nature of God and the nature of man, but that truly his brothers were wicked and they did the wrong thing. They should not have done that. And they meant it for evil, and whatever punishment they get from that, they deserved. Right? Now they repented, of course, so that's good. But it was bad. But it was through that very event that God used it for good. He meant it for good. And so he allowed that to happen. And it's through that happening that led to the entire story. Just imagine if that hadn't happened, right? We wouldn't have this whole story of Joseph rising up in the kingdom of Egypt and becoming, becoming the person that he was and being able to save his fellow men from starvation. So Joseph is a great example, and it's explicitly said that this suffering was meant for a greater good that Joseph would end up being, and so we have the rest of the story. So how about Jonah?
Prophet who didn't want to go, but
And he ended up in the belly of a big fish, suffered for 3 days, and as a result of that, and then the big fish coughed him up on the shore, and so he said, all right, I guess I'll go to Nineveh. So he reluctantly trudged off to Nineveh, and amazing, the Ninevites, became believers, at least some of them. Amazing. And we have the story. The other thing that we have to point out too, we don't want to lose track of this, is that the experiences of these people suffering, resulting in greater good, their experience alone was a greater good. But guess what? We have their stories, and the entire world has their stories, and that is a testimony which is a huge greater good. So we can look at Job, we can look at Joseph, we can look at Jonah, and we can learn from that and say this, and us having access to their stories is a greater good. Stephen, right? Stephen was stoned to death, and that's not very good. But he was a powerful witness, right, in the face of the Pharisees. And so we have his story to reference. He was willing to die for his faith. Remember, all of these early martyrs could have gotten out of their suffering like that. They could have just said, oh, sorry, I was wrong. Jesus actually wasn't who he says it was. Can I go now? They would say, sure. That's all you got to do. How easy, how tempting would it be, like in the case of Peter, so we'll get to him next, how tempting would it be to just say, you know what, God really doesn't want me to die and suffer, so I'll just sort of a little bit deny him, and I don't really mean it, but I'll tell him and I'll kind of get off the hook. And Peter, right, he was in that same situation. And Peter, bless his heart, didn't take much for Peter to cave. It's like, these people just started going, hey, didn't we see you? Aren't you with him? It's like, who, me? He didn't even put up a fight. And yet, what do we see from his suffering wasn't from the persecution of the people that led him to deny his Lord. His suffering was what?
Because he was a follower.
Because what?
He was a follower.
Yes, he was. But even before,
well, because Jesus said, when he said,
you're going to deny me.
No, I'll never do that. I'll never do that. He ends up doing the very thing.
Yeah.
And then because he's just a wreck.
He is a wreck. That is his suffering. Can you imagine the pain of denying your Lord? I mean, I can't imagine, but I'm not so proud to think that it couldn't happen. Like if somebody came and said, I'm going to slit your son's throat unless you deny your Lord. I don't know. But imagine that, say that happens, and then you're like, crap, what did I do? Why? How did I do this? I can't believe it. This is terrible. And you're just filled with remorse and regret, and just your soul is destroyed. And yet, consider the flip side of this when Jesus comes to Peter and said, Peter, you're going to lead my sheep. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Yes. And when that relationship is restored after the depths of the despair, having denied him, and yet he still receives me back and forgives me, oh my gosh, what a greater good that is to experience that, to experience the forgiveness of the Lord that Peter did. And and we have his story to fall back on. So if we, like Peter, if we find ourselves in a circumstance where we deny the Lord, we're feeling the persecution for whatever reason, we deny the Lord, and we're sitting there like Peter was in self-loathing and agony, we can remember this story and say, you know what, even Peter was restored. And so it's not too far from God to rescue me, a sinner who denied my Lord that I even loved, and he'll restore you. And so what a great story, and what encouragement we have to never go there in the first place, but even if we do go there, that there's a possibility of redemption. So that's Peter. And we know, of course, later on, as Peter is filled with the Holy Spirit and he goes and becomes the apostle who preaches to the Jews, and he's persecuted immensely and ends up, tradition says, he ends up being crucified upside down and all that stuff. And no real reason to doubt that, but I won't hang my hat on it. But he suffered for his faith immensely. And he's the one that talks about don't be surprised when this happens to you. Was that Peter or James who said, why are you surprised when you experience the suffering? Don't you know that suffering produces perseverance? Anyway, he gave us that testimony. So then, so the last one. The last example to consider is that of Jesus. So he suffered the greatest suffering I think a person can endure by bearing the sins of the world. We can't even fathom it. I mean, forget the crucifixion, right? I'll take the nails, any one of us could be crucified and feel that yuckiness, right? But we don't know, we have no idea what it's like to bear the weight of the sins of the world upon us. And so that is a terrible evil that the Romans and the Jews conspired to put to death the Son of God. The Jews would deny their Messiah and put him to death. Is the greatest evil that humankind could ever do, and induce the most amount of suffering, I think, arguably, that could ever be endured by a person. The human nature of Christ endured that. And yet, it's that very act that atoned for the sin of those of us who believe. And so, what greater good could that be than the redemption of the believers? So I think Jesus represents the pinnacle of this principle of the greater good that results from suffering. And so, to that end, we've got all of these examples, and we can count many other examples. Here we're giving testimony of sort of, a lot of it is more moral evil. So people inflicting suffering on other people in their depravity, in their evil. We haven't talked about like natural evil. And so there's a whole list of things that we would say is suffering that results from natural evil, like hurricanes and earthquakes, and like the cyclone that just devastated and killed how many people? 200,000 people in Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And so there was a huge, we don't hear too much about it here, but yeah, there was a terrible, devastating cyclone, basically a hurricane in the southern hemisphere that wiped out a whole bunch of people, primarily I think in Mozambique, flooding and whatnot. So, wow, that's tremendous amount of suffering. Is there any greater good that could come of that? Well, if you argue that there shouldn't be any cyclones, there shouldn't be any hurricanes, then you start looking at the implication of, okay, let's remove the forces that cause those things to happen. Pretty soon you start finding that a worse thing will happen. And pretty much like, well, then life couldn't exist. And you end up with, well, which is better, to have life that exists or to have hurricanes? Or you may find that hurricanes are an essential part of the life-sustaining nature of the earth. And so all of this to say, what we're leading up to is, number one, God has revealed that he works all things for good for those who believe. So even the bad things, he takes those and he works those for good for those who believe. And so you look at the examples of the people from Job to Jesus that we talked about, and even when you look at the instance of natural evil, there always is some overarching reason that at least it's plausible that God would allow for a greater good. So when we look at all these things, what we realize is that we are in no position to judge that God doesn't have a greater purpose in the suffering that we endure. So if I were in Joseph's position and I just got thrown into the well and abandoned by nasty brothers, I would be going, this is terrible. This is terrible. And yet God knew that though it was intended for evil by his brothers, God knew that it would lead to the greater good of the rest of the story. And Joseph was in no position to know that, in no position to judge that, and neither are we. And you can look at that across all of these examples. And even when you look at the big picture, and again, getting back to the theme of your paper, we are in no position to judge that this world means that God can't exist, because this world could be the very world that is perfect to get us to the perfect world. And only God can judge that. And so, therefore, if that's the case, then we can't say that it's improbable that God would not allow the suffering that exists, because it's quite likely that this amount of suffering is exactly what is the best to get us to his overarching greater purpose, which is to deliver us into the new heavens and the new earth. So to that extent, I think we can argue that it's not improbable, and that we are not really in a position to say that it's not improbable, because we just don't see the bigger picture that God does. So with those two things, we've kind of dealt with the intellectual problem of evil. We've answered those challenges. There's one more thing I want to say about this. Let's see. Where is it? Yes. And that's this. And so there's a whole nother tack that we can take in relation to the problem of evil and suffering. And we've talked about this before, but I just want to reinforce it as we wrap up our defense against the intellectual problem. And that is that this fundamental thing is that, ironically, if evil and suffering are real, then that means that God must exist. In other words, by posing the very question or the challenge, and we kind of dealt with this when we broached the subject in the first place. If evil and suffering is actually real, then it means there must be some kind of measure of what we mean by evil and suffering. In other words, suffering, if it's something that that ought not to be, right? If suffering is something that ought not to be, then there's got to be something that says how things ought to be, in which relation to this is what it's not. And so the atheist, when he's challenging us with this problem of evil and suffering, has really no basis for saying that things ought to be this way, and because they aren't, that means that God doesn't exist, because the atheist has no foundation for the way things ought to be. So when they're complaining about this, he's admitting to a reference point of what ought to be, which is God. So by posing the very question, he's acknowledging that God exists. Doesn't realize that. So keep that in mind as something perhaps to point out to the atheists that you're contending with, that again, if what they're claiming is that suffering and evil actually do exist as real things, then their worldview doesn't have any basis for that, and therefore they're already in a theistic worldview. Let me share a few thoughts about the emotional problem of suffering. Having dealt with the intellectual side, approaching the emotional side is quite different. We acknowledge that suffering is real and painful, absolutely. We acknowledge that it's bad, even though it has a greater good, maybe, and we can seek that. When you're suffering that real pain, then intellectual answers to that pain are not going to help. So we don't want to approach that at this time. And so while we have intellectual comfort in our reasoning about suffering, we need emotional comfort while we're enduring it. And so this effort of acknowledging the reality of suffering and bearing it in light of a good God and helping others endure it through the emotional suffering that we endure is called lamenting. And this is a biblical principle, and it's described, and I talked about this earlier, and the talk that I went to, and that subsequently I was able to get Dr. Groothuis. I have such a problem remembering how to pronounce his name. On Skype, and Skype with your Ishaka compatriots, and the time zone was so weird that I couldn't get us involved in it, but I got them, and so I got to hear it again. And he has a personal testimony about what it means to lament and lament well as a Christian. And this is a powerful witness in the face of suffering. So how we handle suffering as Christians is a powerful witness to the world, where they marvel at the fact that we can be suffering. Maybe we're suffering in jail, and yet we're rejoicing. And our jailer may be listening to our rejoicing and scratching his head going, what is with these weird Christians? How can they possibly be rejoicing amidst their suffering? They must have something, and now I'm suffering, and I want what they have. And it can be a powerful witness. And comforting those who lament is also a powerful witness. Our compassion to those who are suffering is a powerful witness to the goodness of God working through us. So we're motivated to go and help our brothers and sisters who are suffering, not only because we're commanded to, but also because it is a powerful witness of love when we express our willingness to go and help those who are suffering, to heal the sick, to free those in bondage. That is a tremendous witness to the world of the love of Christ in us. Okay, so that's about all I can do with the emotional problem of suffering. So what I want to do now is first pause for a second and wow, I'm actually ahead. There's 2 videos that will, these are again the short little William Lane Craig animated videos, but really hopefully they'll drive some of these principles home that we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. But any questions, comments about how we've dealt with this problem of suffering and evil?
It seems to include a lot of elements about the moral argument as well.
It does.
I noticed that there's a lot of things you can take from the moral argument and bring into the problem of pain and suffering.
That's right.
So I think it's almost, you can't have one
Goes.
without the other.
That's
Yeah.
kind of why we kind of went from that one into but, because I think well, what would you say? Where's the level of commonality? Where do they intersect?
You have to acknowledge the fact that there is
Yes,
ought to and ought.
that's right.
I think that's where.
You're totally right. When all else fails, man, challenge the atheist with this impossible to bridge the gap problem for them. And that is, how do you go from is, the way things just are, a description, to ought, a prescription, the way they should be? You can't. There is nothing, if God doesn't exist, then there is nothing to prescribe the way things ought to be. So when, atheist friend, you start complaining about things like Christianity sucks, you're bringing you're bringing some reference to the way things ought to be. Where do you get that? And that happens on our moral arguments, and it happens in the issue of, well, there ought not to be any suffering. Who says? Why? I mean, I agree. I agree that there ought not to be. I agree that there's a better world. But I have a basis for why I believe that. And I have a basis for measuring what ought to be. You don't. Your worldview is inconsistent. So you're borrowing from my worldview to do your worldview. And it's a insurmountable problem. Nobody's bridged that. And atheists keep trying and trying and trying. And but there's no bridge. So anything else? It's a huge subject. I mean, like I think I mentioned before, someday I want to teach an entire class on this problem of evil and how people have dealt with it over the years. And it's a good problem because when we're talking about the problem of evil, we can also talk about the problem of good. How do you explain good? And we can talk about, I think it's just wonderful that we can't deny this sense of good. We can't avoid thinking that there ought to be a better world. Well, guess what? On Christianity, there is. It's exactly the whole point. This is exactly the whole point. We we hate this world. We need to be saved from, when we say Jesus saves, what did he save us from? The consequences of this world. We want that better world. So, okay, so let's watch these short videos, and hopefully they'll recap us and reinforce what we've talked about, and then I will tee us up for when we come back from spring break, how we're going to proceed.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil. In part 1, we looked at the logical version of the problem of suffering and evil. This argument attempts to show that since suffering and evil exist, it is logically impossible for God to exist. And we explained why even atheist philosophers admit that this argument fails. But wait! It may still be argued that while it's logically possible that God and suffering both exist, is far from likely. There's just so much pointless suffering, it seems improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting it. This is the probability version of the problem. Suffering provides empirical evidence that God's existence is not impossible, just highly unlikely. Is this a good argument? Consider 3 points. First, we are not in a position to say with any confidence that God probably lacks reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. The problem is that we're limited in space and time, and in intelligence and insight. God, on the other hand, sees every detail of history from beginning to end, and orders it through people's free decisions and actions. In order to achieve His purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within His wider framework. Sometimes, what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator. Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view. In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable. But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion. The third point is, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Consider 4 of these. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness. People often assume that if God exists, His role is to create a comfortable environment for His human pets. They think the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and therefore, God is obligated to keep us happy. However, Christianity presents a radically different view, that the purpose of life is to know God. This alone brings true, lasting fulfillment. Suffering can bring about a deeper, more intimate knowledge of God, either on the part of the one who is suffering or those around him. The whole point of human history is that God, having given us free will, is drawing as many people as He can into His unending kingdom. Suffering is one of the ways God can draw people freely to Himself. In fact, countries that have endured the most hardship often show the highest growth rates for Christianity.
God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and His purpose. Terrible human evils are testimony to man's depravity, a consequence of his alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at moral evil in the world. On the contrary, he expects it. The third doctrine states that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul understood that life on earth and whatever suffering it holds for each of us is temporary. Our pain will not endure forever, but our lives with God will. Paul was not belittling the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. Indeed, he was one of them. But he saw that those suffering will be overwhelmed forever by the ocean of joy that God will give to those who will freely receive it. And the fourth doctrine is this: the knowledge of God is an incomparable good. Knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human existence, an infinite good. Thus, the person who knows God, no matter how much he has suffered, can still say, "God is good to me." So, if Christianity is true, it's not at all improbable that suffering and evil should exist. In summary, for all these reasons, the probability version of the problem of evil is no more successful than the logical version. As a purely intellectual problem, then, the problem of evil does not disprove God's existence. But even if those intellectual arguments fail, the emotional problem of suffering and evil remains very powerful. If you have suffered deeply, or if you've watched someone you love go through intense pain, you may be thinking, "So what if God exists? Why would I want to respond to him or worship him? I feel cold and empty and want nothing to do with him." You're not alone. God knows your name. He knows who you are and what you're going through. God promises to be with you through your suffering. He can give you the strength to endure. Jesus Christ also suffered. Although he was innocent, he was tortured and sentenced to death. His suffering had a purpose: to provide you and me with a life-giving connection to God. Not only does God exist, but he loves you. He seeks after you. He offers you hope. And in time, he will make all things new.
He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.
Yay. So, in the end, we win. All right, in the 2 minutes we have remaining, let me just tee us up for what's next in our class. So, as a reminder, we've laid down the foundations for why a God exists. We've dealt with the number one challenge to that, which is the problem of evil. Now we want to move the rest of the time to why is it that Christianity uniquely is true, and then we'll also deal with some specific relevant challenges in our culture for that. So next couple classes we'll be dealing with the argument from the resurrection. Some apologists take a slightly different approach. It's still an evidential approach to apologetics, but instead of building a foundation using the cosmological arguments and the teleological and the moral arguments, they go straight to this one. And so what they say is that if we can prove that Jesus rose from the dead, then that's a miracle that requires God's existence. Okay? And simultaneously, if we can prove that Christ rose from the dead, it vindicates Christ's claims and therefore makes Christianity true. So there are those who focus all of their attention on on the resurrection. Because with that one argument, you've proven Christianity to be true. Not only that God exists, but he's the Christian God. So, so that's a worthy pursuit. My opinion is I like the other arguments too, so more is better. So let's build a really strong foundation, even though I totally agree that with this one single argument, we can make the case for Christian theism. So I think it's very fortuitous. I didn't plan it this way, but it's going to happen, is that we're dealing with the resurrection right on the heels of Easter coming up, which is we celebrate that. So awesome time. So we're going to start talking about Jesus, and we're going to deal with the question, well, did Jesus even exist, or is he just a mythical character? A fading minority of skeptics question whether Jesus was actually a real person or not. Okay, this is, like I say, a fading minority of critics. So we won't spend too much time on that. But despite the fact that most scholars would agree that Jesus exists, in the same way that most scholars would acknowledge, as we just saw, reinforced, that the logical problem of evil is no longer, contended. Most scholars don't raise any eyebrows about the existence of Jesus himself. So, but we'll look at that. What were his claims? So, Scripture says that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. What does that mean? He claimed to be the Messiah. What does that mean? Why do we know that that's true? And then, what were the events surrounding his death and burial? And the critical question is this: did he in fact rise from the dead? And how do we know that to be true? And if so, what does this mean? So these are the framing questions around the historicity of the resurrection. And what we're going to find is that yes, Jesus did exist. We have good historical evidence in Scripture and outside of Scripture. What were his claims? His claims were that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, that he deserved to be worshipped, and so therefore he was divine. The events surrounding his death and burial are recorded in the Gospels. Did he rise from the dead? Yes, he did. We have multiple independent eyewitness testimony from various sources. People were willing to go to their death believing that. So yes, we have every indication that he did rise from the dead. And guess what? If God exists, then that's possible. Which is why I like this approach, where we've already dealt with the question of God's existence. So hey, if God exists, then certainly he can raise somebody from the dead. And what does this mean? Well, it means that Christianity is true. And if it's true, then we ought to order our lives around it. Therefore, I'm a Christian. Okay? One fun thing that I hope we have time for is this, and this will introduce us to a number of other topics. But one challenge that you'll often confront is that Scripture is just a mess of contradictions. So why should we believe it? I mean, take the case of the death and resurrection accounts of Christ. You read the four Gospels, and they're all different, right? They all tell a different story. So how can you possibly believe this thing if it's all contradictory? They can't even get the facts right about the central claim of Christianity. So I'm going to dispel that, and I'm going to give you an account of the events surrounding the death and resurrection that is described in the four Gospels in such a way that despite their differences, they all fit together really nicely. And you go, wow, that's cool. And I discovered this. It was the work of a couple scholars, and I just, when I was contending with that challenge of the contradictory nature of the gospel accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection, I ran into this and I walked through, and I'm not going to say that this is how it happened. I'm just going to say that this is how it could have happened, that makes all of those accounts just work together. And it's like, great. So that'll be good ammo for you to have in your toolbox to know at least that it's called a harmony. When we take the 4 gospel accounts and we put them together, we harmonize them into one consistent account. So, all right, so last but not least, for homework, you have spring break, so no class next week. But in the meantime, please read both the Part 2 interlude and Chapter 8 when it gets into who did Jesus say that he was. And then I really do like these little short videos, like the kind that we just watched. There's a whole collection of them. And there's 3 of them relating to the resurrection. And I'd like you to watch this one in particular. Just look it up. Reasonable faith. Who did Jesus think that he was? So this is addressing who did Jesus claim he was? Did he really claim to be the Messiah or not? So, okay, that's all. God bless you. Have a great break.
You too.
I will. And so, goodbye, Ishaka.